Hello, my dear viewers. Today's episode will be filled with horror, tragedy, and mystery. I'll share two stories based on real events that expose the darkest sides of life. These are crimes you won't be able to forget. Let's begin. Today, I will tell you about a relatively old case. Who is this ruthless individual, and what horrific crime did they commit? Let's find out. On January 20th, 1998, a murder took place at the entrance of a private house in Gwangmyeong, Gyeonggi Province. The victim was a 37-year-old woman named Choi Isuk, name changed. Her body was found right in front of the house where she lived. But the manner in which she was killed is absolutely shocking. Isuk was literally torn apart. This wasn't a single act of violence. There wasn't a single unbroken part left on her body. Fortunately, a suspect was identified immediately after the crime. Why? Because Isuk had been stalked for several years. Because her stalker turned out to be 35-year-old Nam Taek-yu. But here's the astonishing part. 8 months before the murder, he had already tried to kill Isuk, though his plan failed. What was the connection between these two people that led to such a tragic end? As it turned out, Choi Isuk and Nam Taek-yu had once been in a relationship. The exact details of how they met remain unclear, but according to some reports, their paths crossed while Isuk was working as a 6th-grade civil servant. Starting in 1994, they dated for 2 years. However, throughout their relationship, Taek-yu exhibited unbearable aggression. He frequently flew into fits of rage and even resorted to physical violence. Isuk often confided in her friends saying, "My boyfriend scares me." However, at the time, the concept of relationship violence wasn't widely recognized, and society didn't view it as a serious issue. Instead of offering support, people would dismiss her fears with remarks like, "Well, couples fight sometimes." "Well, men are naturally rough," was the kind of response Isuk received when she tried to voice her concerns. No one took her seriously, leaving her to face this nightmare on her own. After 2 years in 1996, their relationship finally ended. Surprisingly, it was Nam Taek-yu who initiated the breakup. He claimed he no longer felt love or interest toward Isuk. Moreover, he criticized her for being too agreeable and predictable, which, in his words, made the relationship boring for him. Unlike Taek-yu, however, Isuk didn't want to break up. Why? At first glance, her reluctance seems odd, but it's important to consider the context. At the time of the breakup, she was 33 years old. In 1990s Korea, most women got married around the age of 25. For Isuk, being unmarried at her age already placed her in the category of late marriage by societal standards. She dreamed of getting married as soon as possible to build a stable family, much like many others of her generation. But there was another issue: Nam Taek-yu. Throughout their 2-year relationship, Nam Taek-yu repeatedly said the same thing. "You'll never be able to find another man. Look at your age. Who would want to be with an old woman like you? Only I can be with you." This was blatant gaslighting and psychological manipulation, which deeply broke Isuk's spirit. When Taek-yu ended the relationship, Isuk desperately tried to hold on to him, but he was cold, turned his back on her, and even disappeared from her life entirely. While Isuk struggled to cope with the breakup, Taek-yu moved on to other women. However, the more he interacted with them, the more he realized, they don't have what Isuk had. She listened to me. She was obedient. This realization struck a nerve with him, and he decided to come back. Suddenly, after some time, Taek-yu reappeared in Isuk's life and proposed starting their relationship over again. An entirely self-centered move. But to his surprise, Isuk firmly refused. By then, she was already in a relationship with another man. This new partner, unlike her ex, the new man was incredibly caring and kind. Through this relationship, Isuk finally realized that men didn't have to be aggressive or cruel. She understood that she could be happy without fear or pressure. The thought of returning to Nam Taek-yu never even crossed her mind. For Taek-yu, however, this was a devastating blow. He was furious. In his mind, Isuk had always been a woman completely dependent on him, someone he believed was in his hands, and now she dared to reject him? How could she possibly date another man without his permission? His rage boiled over as he realized that Isuk was no longer under his control. From that moment, Nam Taek-yu completely lost control of himself. He quit his job and began obsessively stalking Isuk. He practically camped outside her house, watching her every move. Worse, he gathered personal information about her family and her new boyfriend. Soon, he began sending Asik threatening letters. In these letters, he demanded, "Leave that bastard and come back to me. Otherwise, I'll kill your entire family." The text was filled with vulgar language too graphic to repeat, but he didn't stop there. Taekyu sent Asik a letter written in his own blood, intensifying the terror of the situation. This maniacal harassment continued for 8 months. By May of 1997, his threats became even more menacing, and Asik's anxiety reached its peak. She began to fear that Taekyu might harm her new boyfriend as well. Fearing for the safety of her new boyfriend, Asik, after much deliberation, decided to meet Nam Taekyu face-to-face to put an end to the situation once and for all. The meeting was arranged in a park in Gwangmyeong, where they were supposed to talk privately. The conversation was brief. Asik quickly realized that reasoning with Taekyu was futile. He completely ignored her words and remained fixated on his own delusions. Finally, summoning her courage, she told him everything directly. "I will not come back to you. I am engaged and getting married next month. Please stop this." With those words, she turned and began walking away quickly, feeling an urgent need to leave the place as soon as possible. Taekyu was stunned. Asik's words about her upcoming wedding hit him like a thunderclap. "What? She's getting married?" His face froze in confusion and shock. As he regained his composure and realized that Asik was walking away, he couldn't simply let her go. His mind boiled with rage. "How dare you? You had the audacity to get married?" Enraged, he pulled out a knife he had hidden on him and charged after Asik. He caught up to her and stabbed her in the chest. This horrific scene unfolded right in front of several people strolling through the park. Taekyu immediately attempted to flee the scene, but the witnesses quickly called the police. Thanks to their swift action, Asik's life was saved. Though she sustained serious injuries, she survived the attack. Shortly after the attack, Taekyu was apprehended. However, for Asik, the joy of surviving was overshadowed by a profound sense of relief. Finally, Taekyu was in the hands of justice. Upon hearing the news of Nam Taekyu's arrest, Asik was able to breathe a sigh of relief. She believed that having escaped this nightmare, she would never have to face this man again. A month later, she married her boyfriend, and her life seemed to enter a long-awaited period of peace and happiness. But this peaceful period was short-lived. In January 1998, Taekyu, who had been convicted and held in custody, was unexpectedly released on parole. The moment he was free, he immediately began searching for Asik. When he learned that she was already married, he was consumed by rage and a sense of betrayal. Unable to accept this reality, he decided to exact his revenge. Taekyu's first step was to track down Asik's parents, and within a week, he discovered where she lived. He showed up at her home, and from that moment on, Asik's life once again descended into a living nightmare. Nam Taekyu resumed his stalking, but this time it became even more relentless and horrifying. He called Asik incessantly, both day and night, on her home phone and at work. Threatening letters, messages written in blood, and the constant feeling of being watched no matter where she went drove her to the brink of madness. Asik's life had turned into a living nightmare. Each day she sank deeper into despair. Fear consumed her. What if any action she took provoked Taekyu? What if he harmed her husband? In an attempt to avoid escalating the situation, she decided to endure and ignore all his actions. But her silence and indifference only enraged Taekyu further. He saw it as an insult, a deliberate attempt to humiliate him. In his twisted mind, a new thought began to take shape. This time, I will kill her. To carry out his plan, Taekyu prepared more meticulously this time. Instead of a knife, he decided to use an axe, believing that his previous weapon had been insufficiently effective. The attack took place on the morning of January 22nd, 1998. Nam Taekyu hid near Asik's house in the Cheolsan Tudong area of Gwangmyeong, waiting for her to come outside. After a while, Asik emerged, preparing to leave for work. At that moment, Taekyu lunged at her. In shock, Asik tried to retreat back into the house, but Taekyu managed to grab her by the hair before she could escape. Boiling with rage, Taekyu screamed, "I wrote you letters! You were supposed to respond! How many times did I tell you, divorce that bastard?" Then he began beating her with unimaginable brutality. But this time, Esek refused to stay silent. She fought back and shouted, "Even if I get divorced, I will never come back to you. Get out of my life." The argument escalated, growing more heated with every passing second. At one point, Taekyu completely lost control. In a fit of fury, he shoved Esek against the wall, then pulled out the hidden axe. He aimed it at her. Nam Taekyu struck Esek with the axe, delivering blows to her head and chest. He didn't stop until she stopped breathing. That's why her body was left with such a horrifying number of injuries. Once Esek was dead, Taekyu quickly fled the scene. Now you understand why I earlier referred to him as a ruthless man. His actions were monstrous. Given his prior behavior, Taekyu immediately became the prime suspect. However, despite the clear evidence of his involvement, the investigation didn't proceed as smoothly as one might expect. It turned out to be far more complicated. The reason catching Nam Taekyu proved so difficult was that he had left his job long ago and was living a transient lifestyle without a fixed address. The police simply couldn't locate him. Moreover, in the late 1990s, there were no CCTV systems in place, making it nearly impossible to track his movements. Seeking assistance, the police turned to the popular television program Police Department People, which was watched by over 20% of viewers. 2 months after the murder, in March, episode 232 of the program featured a segment on Nam Taekyu, declaring him wanted nationwide. A month later, in April, his face appeared again on another show, Wanted, the 25th Hour. In this way, information about him quickly spread across the country. After these broadcasts, the police received an overwhelming number of tips from witnesses. However, none of them proved useful. Most often, people mistakenly identified others as Taekyu. By October, 6 months after the first broadcast, the police once again turned to the program Wanted, the 25th Hour, to air information about Nam Taekyu. Among the numerous calls that came in, one anonymous tip stood out. The caller said, "A few months ago, a homeless man appeared at Gupabal Station who looks strikingly similar to Nam Taekyu. He wears glasses, has a sharp jawline, and small eyes." The description was detailed enough to seem credible to the police. Considering the information reliable, they immediately headed to Gupabal Station. And indeed, when they arrived at the location, their suspicions were confirmed. The homeless man was Nam Taekyu. Thus, after 3 public announcements about his manhunt on television, he was finally captured. As it was later revealed, Taekyu had been hiding all this time by moving between temporary jobs and homeless shelters. He used a fake name and avoided drawing attention to himself, trying to keep as low a profile as possible. However, to get food, he even resorted to stealing from empty houses. If not for that anonymous tip, Taekyu might have continued his crimes. But thanks to the vigilance of a witness and the persistent efforts of the police, he was finally arrested. Now, everyone awaited the trial and the justice that would be served to this ruthless criminal. This case is truly intriguing, and I've never encountered anything like it before. Many might assume that Nam Taekyu received a life sentence for his horrifying crimes. However, strangely enough, I couldn't find any definitive information about his final verdict. If anyone knows more about this case, it would be great to hear additional details. The media indeed lacks clear reporting on the court's ultimate decision in this matter. An interesting twist is connected to the April episode of Wanted, the 25th Hour, when Nam Taekyu was featured again. That same episode also covered another individual, 33-year-old Nam Taekyong. If you compare their photos, you'll notice a certain resemblance. Their names, as well as some facial features, are indeed similar. This could have been a source of confusion, or simply an intriguing coincidence. That's correct. Nam Taekyong was the younger brother of Nam Taekyu, and both turned out to be criminals. Taekyong was also a murder suspect. 4 months before Asek's murder in September 1997, he committed the robbery murder of a taxi driver in Hwasun County, South Jeolla Province. His method was calculated. Late at night, he would pose as a passenger, hailing a taxi and requesting to be driven to a deserted location. Once they arrived, he would pretend to pay the fare, only to suddenly threaten the driver and steal their money. Taekyong had an accomplice, and their plan usually went off without a hitch. However, during one such robbery, the taxi driver said something unexpected, Young men, you can't live your lives robbing and committing crimes. These words enraged Taex-yong, who took them as a personal insult. In a fit of anger, he stabbed the taxi driver, killing him. After that, Nam Taex-yong remained in hiding from the police for 13 months. Remarkably, the arrests of both Nam brothers occurred under similar circumstances. After Nam Taex-yong's case was featured on the Wanted, the 25th Hour program on October 21, 1998, he was arrested the very next day in the same Hwasun County. Returning to the case of Choi Ae-suk, it's important to note that her murder and the crimes of her ex-boyfriend Taek-yu left a profound impact on society. These events forced people to confront the devastating realities of violence, stalking, and their terrifying consequences. At the time, the police did not take crimes related to stalking seriously. They saw it as a private matter between a man and a woman, something that didn't warrant their intervention. This negligent attitude ultimately led to Choi Ae-suk losing her life. Think about it. This happened in 1998. How much time has passed since then? Almost 27 years. Yet why does this story feel so familiar, as if it happened just yesterday? Aside from the mention of the absence of CCTV back then, everything else sounds like a modern case. We are told that, thanks to advancements in technology and the widespread use of surveillance cameras, it is now harder for serial killers to carry out their crimes. This undoubtedly helps catch criminals before they can commit further acts. However, we still see news of victims of stalking. In fact, it seems that such cases have even increased in number compared to the past. This raises unsettling questions about how much progress has truly been made in preventing these crimes and protecting victims from the devastating consequences of stalking and violence. This situation raises an important question. Has our society truly changed? Is the world now safer for victims of stalking? While technology can assist in investigations, without a shift in societal perception and a serious approach to addressing violence, tragedies like the one involving Choi Ae-suk continue to occur. Is this acceptable? Clearly, society urgently needs measures and systems that can effectively protect victims from stalking and violence. Without such changes, in 10 or 20 years, we will likely hear about similar tragic cases all over again. The time to act is now, by addressing the root causes, strengthening protections, and ensuring that victims are taken seriously before it's too late. Only then can we prevent history from repeating itself. Don't go anywhere. The second story is about to begin, and it's just as gripping. How did you feel about the first one? Share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy reading what you have to say. Today we delve into a case that began on April 4, 2012 at 1 a.m., when a peculiar call was received at the Panama police station in the Tong district of Daejeon. The message relayed to the operator left them baffled. A nervous voice belonging to a middle-aged person reported, "It looks like one person is dead. Another seems to still be alive, but this is murder. Please come quickly." What made this statement so unusual? Typically, in such situations, callers describe what they see at that very moment. However, in this instance, the caller confidently declared it to be murder and immediately concluded that one individual was already dead. The police quickly arrived at the scene, only to find themselves in the midst of a nightmare. A small apartment was completely drenched in blood. The apartment had a simple layout. Just beyond the front door, there was a clear view of the main bedroom. It was there that they found the body of the 50-year-old apartment owner, Mr. Kim. He was already dead. But that wasn't all. In the center of the room lay another individual, also around 50 years old, a neighbor, Mr. Im. He was unconscious but still breathing. The officers immediately called for paramedics to transport him to the hospital. However, the person who drew the most attention at the scene was another individual present, a 50-year-old man named Mr. Lee, the one who had called the police. He was sitting in the middle of the blood-soaked crime scene, completely covered in blood, calmly scratching his chin. What made the situation even stranger was that he was wearing sunglasses, despite being indoors and surrounded by police officers. The investigators immediately began trying to figure out what was going on. When the police arrived at the scene, Mr. Lee slowly stood up and began explaining what had happened. His speech was slurred, and the strong smell of alcohol surrounded him. This raised a critical question. What exactly had occurred? It turned out that the deceased, Mr. Kim, the injured Mr. Im, and Mr. Lee, who had made the call, were neighbors in the same apartment complex. They often gathered to drink and play Go Stop, a popular card game that sometimes turned into a high-stakes pastime. On the evening of the tragedy, they had gathered again at Kim's apartment. As usual, drinking and playing began. However, at some point, a disagreement arose between Kim and Im, escalating into a heated argument. Lee explained that during the altercation, he briefly stepped out of Kim's apartment to go back to his own. When Lee returned, he claimed to have found Kim dead and Im unconscious. When asked by the police what had happened and why the conflict had ended so disastrously, Lee responded with surprising indifference. It seems they fought, and Kim appears to have died. Lee's statement immediately raised suspicions due to his calm demeanor, which was highly unusual for a witness at the scene of a murder. Yet he failed to provide a clear explanation of how the events unfolded or why they had led to such a tragic outcome. Security cameras captured Mr. Lee, who would later become the complainant, entering the building where the incident took place at around 8:30 p.m. A search of the apartment where the crime occurred confirmed that a brutal altercation, or possibly a murder, had taken place. The scene was one of utter chaos. Scattered belongings, empty bottles of alcohol, Go Stop playing cards, and cigarette butts littered the space. Most shocking of all was the blood, not only pooled on the floor but also splattered heavily across the walls. Neighbors reported hearing a loud scream. One resident, who lived in the adjacent apartment, mentioned that around 10 p.m., while watching television, he heard someone yell loudly, "Ah!" This statement led the police to believe that the events unfolded at approximately 10 p.m. To confirm the timeline and sequence of events, the police began analyzing footage from surveillance cameras installed at all key points: the building's entrance, stairwells, and other possible access points. Thanks to these cameras, it was established that Lee had entered the building approximately an hour and a half before the estimated time of the tragedy. This discovery cast further suspicion on Lee, as his claim that he briefly left the apartment now needed to be carefully verified against the established timeline. Yes, this was highly suspicious. The police continued to review surveillance footage to piece together the timeline of events. The recordings revealed that Lee entered Kim's apartment at around 8:30 p.m., wearing a white cap and a black jacket. However, when he was later confronted by the police, he was dressed in a black cap and a red jacket. This raised significant concerns for the investigators. When asked why he had changed his clothes, Lee calmly replied that he just went home to change because his clothes got dirty. Such a nonchalant explanation seemed far too casual, given the gravity of the situation. Further review of the surveillance footage revealed that Lee left Kim's apartment at 8:24 p.m., no longer wearing the white cap he had on when he arrived. This meant he had been in the apartment for about 2 hours. Now, let's recall the crucial testimony from the neighbor. The scream, described as a loud "ah," was heard around 10 p.m., aligning with the estimated time of the tragedy. This suggested that Lee was likely present in Kim's apartment at the time of the murder. Yet after the incident, he unexpectedly went home, changed his clothes, and returned to the apartment to report what had happened. These actions appeared to be an attempt to conceal evidence. The fact that Lee changed his clothing and the discrepancies in the timeline became critical pieces of evidence, further intensifying police suspicions of his involvement in the crime. Lee's actions grew increasingly suspicious. After changing his clothes, he returned to Kim's apartment at around 1 a.m., just 20 minutes before making the call to the police. However, he left the apartment again after only 5 minutes. This time, he was carrying the white cap he had worn earlier, which had gone missing after his initial visit. It was later discovered that this cap was stained with blood. Surveillance cameras captured Lee descending to the first floor and disposing of the cap in a clothing donation bin. He then calmly returned to the apartment, acting as if nothing had happened, and only then called the police. What does this indicate? Most likely, such actions can be interpreted as an attempt to destroy evidence. After all, if Lee had simply noticed that the cap was stained, he could have left it at home. Instead, he chose to dispose of it in a location where it would be harder to retrieve. The act of discarding the blood-stained cap significantly deepens suspicions about Lee's involvement in the crime. This appears to be a deliberate effort to conceal evidence, directly contradicting his initial claim that he knew nothing about what happened and was merely a witness to the aftermath of the altercation between Kim and Im. The discovery of blood-stained items in the trash bin significantly heightened suspicions about Lee. When the police confronted him with evidence, surveillance footage, and the bloodied cap found in the clothing donation container, he adamantly denied any involvement. He claimed that the blood on his clothing and cap was incidental, explaining that it got there while he was allegedly trying to break up the fight between Kim and Im. As for the cap, he said he discarded it simply because it was stained and no longer wearable. Although his explanations weren't entirely implausible, they failed to fully convince investigators. The police decided to search Lee's home, a move that became a turning point in the investigation. During the search, investigators found traces of blood near the entrance to Lee's apartment and around the balcony area. When they checked what lay beneath the balcony, they discovered a garbage disposal area. This led them to suspect that Lee might have been discarding evidence by throwing it out of the window. The investigators immediately descended to the garbage containers and began their search. It wasn't long before they uncovered a pair of Lee's blood-stained slippers. On the inside of one slipper, they found a paper napkin with bloodstains stuck to it, suggesting that Lee had used it to wipe blood off his feet before discarding both the slippers and the napkin. This raised a critical question for the investigation. Why did Lee dispose of his slippers? If he wasn't involved in the crime, why get rid of an item that could potentially serve as evidence? Such an act seemed less like a coincidence and more like a deliberate attempt to conceal traces of his involvement. It was highly suspicious that, despite the mounting evidence, Lee continued to deny his involvement. He insisted, "I have nothing to do with this case. Throwing away old, ruined slippers, is that a crime?" Yet his explanations increasingly sounded like feeble attempts to justify his actions. At this point, a new key figure emerged in the case. Im. The sole survivor of the incident finally regained consciousness. The police immediately went to him, eager to learn what had truly transpired that night. Unfortunately, Im was unable to provide any detailed information. He recounted that he remembered the three of them, himself, Kim, and Lee, drinking together in Kim's apartment. However, everything that happened after that was completely erased from his memory. Given the severity of his injuries, this amnesia seemed plausible, but it created a significant obstacle for the investigation. Thus, despite having a living witness, the investigators still lacked a concrete explanation of the events. They found themselves in a tense situation. The evidence against Lee was mounting, but the absence of direct testimony made it difficult to solidify the case. In addition to being the only survivor at the time he was discovered, Im became a crucial figure in the police's efforts to piece together what had happened that night. However, his testimony was extremely limited. He could only recall that the three of them, himself, Kim, and Lee, had been drinking together, but he couldn't remember anything about the subsequent events. This was a significant disappointment for the investigators. The situation grew even more tragic a month later when Im, after emerging from a coma, succumbed to the injuries he had sustained. His death not only compounded the gravity of the case, but also cast doubt on any theories suggesting his potential involvement in the crime. The weapon used in the attack revealed an extraordinary level of brutality and rage. The tool, a ratchet cable cutter, was far from a typical murder weapon. This added complexity to the case, as it was difficult to imagine such an instrument being used to inflict the extensive injuries observed. According to the autopsy results, Kim died from multiple blows to the head and shoulders. His body bore over 80 wounds inflicted by a blunt object. Im also sustained severe injuries, with at least 10 blows to the head, which ultimately led to his death a month later. The police concluded that the attacker acted with extreme anger, or in a state of emotional frenzy, as the sheer number of blows did not align with actions taken in self-defense or during a spontaneous altercation. Further examination of the bloodstains on the tool revealed fingerprints. This discovery had the potential to become a breakthrough in the case. Meanwhile, the questions continued to pile up. Why hadn't the murder weapon been carefully hidden? Why had the attacker chosen this specific tool? And most importantly, what had triggered such a savage crime? Using the ratchet cable cutter, the perpetrator struck the same areas of the victims' bodies repeatedly, clearly intending to kill. Despite the tool's lightweight nature, it became a deadly weapon through the force and repetition of the blows. Moreover, Lee's fingerprints were found on the cable cutter, a discovery that seemed like it would serve as conclusive evidence. However, Lee proved to be remarkably cunning. Almost as if anticipating that his fingerprints would be discovered, he preemptively told the police, "I accidentally picked up the cable cutter without even thinking." This statement appeared to be a calculated move, a preemptive defense strategy that underscored his deliberate and shrewd nature. In summary, Lee's defense strategy was constructed as follows. He claimed he had accidentally touched the cable cutter, accounting for his fingerprints. He stated that he changed his clothes because they were dirty. He explained that he discarded the cap and slippers because they were stained with blood. The only witness, Im, had died without providing any testimony. For the police, the situation became extraordinarily challenging. Despite mounting suspicions and circumstantial evidence pointing to Lee, they lacked direct proof to conclusively tie him to the murders. This left the investigation at an impasse, as everything seemed to implicate Lee, yet the case lacked the irrefutable facts needed to secure a conviction. At this stage, the investigative team turned to their last resort: bloodstain pattern analysis. This technique uses the size, shape, and distribution of bloodstains at the crime scene to reconstruct the sequence of events. The fundamental principle of bloodstain pattern analysis lies in the fact that the shape and diameter of blood droplets depend on the angle and direction from which they fall. For example, analyzing how and from which side the blows were delivered can reveal the direction of the attacks and the approximate position of the assailant. Furthermore, this method can help identify the weapon used and even estimate the number of strikes inflicted. It's no surprise that this technique is often referred to as creating a criminal profile through blood. At the crime scene, there were countless bloodstains, prompting the police to bring in an expert who spent 4 months meticulously analyzing thousands of droplets. This became a long and intense battle between the suspect and forensic science. The results of the analysis provided critical insights into the events of that night. For instance, in the case of the apartment owner, Kim, blood spatter on the wall in his bedroom revealed patterns consistent with forceful blows from a blunt object. These stains demonstrated the sheer intensity of the attack, with blood projecting outward due to the force of the strikes. This data confirmed that the assault began in the bedroom. The direction and shape of the spatter helped determine Kim's position at the time of the attack, as well as the approximate location of the assailant. This analysis became a pivotal step in reconstructing the sequence of events that unfolded on that fateful night. The bloodstain analysis revealed further details that contradicted Lee's account. On the bedroom wall, investigators found blood marks that had dripped from the bloodied weapon. This confirmed that Kim was positioned near the wall when he was struck repeatedly, leading to his death. However, inconsistencies arose in the case of Im. His blood was also found on the same wall, indicating that he too had likely been attacked in front of it. Yet when his body was discovered, he was lying in the center of the bedroom. This discrepancy suggested that his body had been deliberately moved after the attack. Such evidence raised new questions about the sequence of events and strengthened the suspicion that Lee might have staged aspects of the crime scene. Under Im's body, investigators found bloodstains whose altered shape indicated they had been disturbed after the attack, with the body placed on top of them. This was a clear sign that someone had dragged Im to the center of the room after the assault. But why? Why would the perpetrator move the body? What made the scene even stranger was the condition of the bodies when discovered. They were unnaturally clean. While the floor and walls of the room were drenched in blood, the victims' bodies, including their soles and clothing, were almost devoid of bloodstains. If Lee's version was true, that Kim and Im had been involved in a violent fight, their bodies should have been marked with blood transferred during the struggle. Yet, no such traces were found. This stark inconsistency further undermined Lee's account and deepened the mystery surrounding his actions. Moreover, there were no intersecting blood trails between the locations where the bodies were found, effectively ruling out the possibility of physical contact during the alleged fight. All of this pointed to the conclusion that Lee's account was fabricated, and that the bodies had likely been deliberately arranged to create a false narrative of events. It became evident that the likelihood of Kim and Im actually fighting was extremely low. The bloodstain analysis and the condition of the bodies revealed that the story of a mutual altercation was a fabrication. Im's body had been intentionally moved to make it appear as though the two men had died as a result of their fight. The only person who had insisted from the very beginning that Kim and Im had quarreled was Lee. With this mounting evidence, Lee emerged as the prime suspect in the case. An additional piece of evidence came in the form of sock prints found at the crime scene. These prints, left by someone walking across the blood-soaked floor in socks, matched the size and shape of Lee's feet precisely. This became a pivotal piece of evidence directly linking him to the crime. Based on the collected evidence, investigators were able to reconstruct a likely sequence of events. Lee decided to kill Kim and Im, likely following a heated argument during their gambling session. The ghost op cards found at the scene suggested that the conflict had erupted right at the gaming table. This reconstruction painted a chilling picture of the crime, with the sock prints and the fabricated fight narrative pointing decisively to Lee as the orchestrator of the brutal murders. Following his plan, Lee first attacked Kim near the entrance to the bedroom. This location became the primary site of the assault, as evidenced by the blood spatter on the walls. Afterward, he turned on Im, who was also likely in the bedroom, inflicting severe injuries upon him. To stage the scene as a fight, Lee moved Im's body to the center of the room and then meticulously cleaned up certain traces to cover his tracks. However, he left behind critical evidence: sock prints, fingerprints, and bloodstains that contradicted his version of events. Ultimately, through painstaking forensic analysis, Lee was exposed as the perpetrator. His attempts to conceal the truth and fabricate evidence were unraveled, bringing the investigation to its conclusion. According to the reconstructed sequence of events, Lee began his attack with Im, striking him with the cable cutter. He then turned his attention to Kim, delivering numerous blows that resulted in his death. After the killings, Lee went into the living room, washed his hands, and started planning how to conceal his actions. His plan involved staging the scene to look like a fight between Kim and Im, giving the impression of a mutual conflict. To achieve this, he moved Im's body closer to Kim's, arranging them to suggest a struggle had occurred. He then used a napkin to wipe blood from his feet before calmly leaving the crime scene. The neighbor who heard screams around 10 p.m. provided a crucial timestamp, indicating that the crime occurred between 10 o'clock and 10:24 p.m. This timeline aligned with surveillance footage showing Lee leaving the apartment at 10:24 p.m. Despite the scientifically supported conclusions, Lee continued to insist on his innocence, denying all accusations. Nevertheless, the investigation and subsequent trial were long and required considerable effort to prove his guilt. In May 2013, the court sentenced Lee to 17 years in prison. The verdict stated that, although there was no single direct piece of evidence against Lee, the combination of clues and the logical sequence of events left no room for doubt that he committed the murders. His attempts to stage the scene and conceal evidence only reinforced suspicions and became a critical part of the case against him. Thus, the court records indicated that Lee was found guilty of murder based on circumstantial evidence. This case became one of the rare instances in South Korea where a murder conviction was secured without direct evidence. As for Lee's motive, it remained unknown, as he continued to deny his involvement. Whether the crime was the result of a sudden burst of rage during a conflict at the gambling table or driven by deeper, hidden reasons remains a mystery that could not be conclusively uncovered. This case became a landmark example of the power of modern forensic methods. It demonstrated that even in the absence of clear evidence, eyewitnesses, or direct proof, a crime can still be solved. The meticulous analysis of blood patterns, footprints, and the smallest details at the crime scene provided a solid foundation for uncovering the truth. This story serves as a clear reminder that committing the perfect crime in South Korea is nearly impossible. And perhaps for those who believe their crimes remain hidden and unresolved, this case stands as a warning. Justice can find them, even years later.